The dust cloud from the departing ships had settled hours ago, but Robert Hayes still stood at the observation deck window, staring at the empty landing pad where humanity's last hope had been just that morning. The silence that followed the roar of engines felt heavier than the gravity on this alien world they now called home forever. Behind him, the sounds of despair echoed through the corridors of Settlement 7, old voices cracking with fear, the shuffle of worn boots on metal floors, and the occasional sob that someone tried to muffle but couldn't quite hide. 847 souls, all past their 70th year, all deemed too old and too weak for the journey back to Earth's struggling colonies. They left. "Us here to die," whispered Margaret Chen from her wheelchair near the communications console. Her arthritic fingers traced the dark screen that had gone silent after the final transmission from Captain Torres. "Colony evacuation complete. Non-essential personnel remaining as per Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha. Earth Command sends its regrets." Robert turned away from the window, his engineer's mind already cataloging their resources even as his heart struggled with the abandonment. 15 years he had helped build this place, watching it grow from prefab shelters to a thriving community of 12,000. Now it felt like a tomb, its corridors too wide, its systems humming with an emptiness that machinery couldn't fill. "We're not dead yet," he said, loud enough for the 40 people gathered in the common area to hear. His voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades solving problems that others called impossible. "Frank, what's our security situation?" Frank Wilson pushed himself up from his chair, his old military bearing still evident despite the walking stick he now needed. At 75, he had been deemed unfit for the physical demands of evacuation transport, but his mind remained sharp as the day he had first set foot on this world. Perimeter sensors are still active, but without regular maintenance they'll fail within 6 months. Food stores will last maybe 4 if we're careful. Medical supplies are critically low. Dr. Helen Rodriguez looked up from the tablet where she had been reviewing their remaining resources. Her career as a xenobiologist had been cut short when the evacuation prioritized younger scientists, but her knowledge of this world's ecosystem remained unmatched. "The recycling systems are designed for full colony capacity. They're inefficient at our current population level. Water won't be a problem, but food production will be." "What about the natives?" asked Grace Kim, the former cultural liaison who had spent more time with the planet's indigenous species than any other human. Her Korean accent had softened over the decades, but her curiosity about the Navani people remained as strong as ever. "They've survived here for thousands of years without our technology." The mention of the Navani caused an uncomfortable silence. During the colony's expansion, most humans had dismissed them as primitive, their simple villages and apparent lack of advanced technology marking them as irrelevant to human progress. They lived in bioformed structures that seemed to grow from the earth itself, cultivated crops that followed patterns no human botanist understood, and communicated in ways that went beyond mere language. "You think they'd help us?" Frank asked, skepticism clear in his voice. His military training had taught him to be wary of unknowns, and the Navani remained largely mysterious despite 15 years of coexistence. "We never exactly made an effort to be good neighbors," Grace nodded thoughtfully, remembering her limited interactions with the tall, graceful beings who seemed to flow rather than walk. "They're not hostile, but they're not exactly welcoming either. During the early years, I managed some basic communication. They seemed more interested in watching us than engaging with us." Robert walked to the central planning table where colony maps still displayed the full scope of human settlement. Most of the outlying areas were already powering down, their residents evacuated or relocated to the central hub. The Navani, villages scattered across the continent, remained marked as indigenous settlements with minimal detail. "How much do we actually know about them?" "More than the evacuation committee thought was worth preserving," Helen replied with barely contained bitterness. Her life's work studying the unique ecosystem of this world had been abandoned along with her. They have a sophisticated understanding of biological systems. Their agriculture yields are actually higher per acre than our hydroponic farms, but they achieve it through methods we never took the time to study properly. The weight of their Situation settled over the group like the planet's heavy evening mist. They were alone on an alien world, cut off from human civilization, with failing technology and diminishing supplies. Yet as Robert looked around at the faces gathered, in the dim light of emergency illumination, he saw something that the evacuation planners had missed entirely. These were people who had built this colony with their own hands. Margaret had programmed the first atmospheric processors. Frank had established the security protocols that kept them safe for 15 years. Helen had cataloged hundreds of species and identified which were safe for human consumption. Grace had learned to communicate with beings from another world entirely. "We have something the evacuation ships don't," Robert said, his voice growing stronger as the idea formed. "We have time, no quotas to meet, no reports to file, no pressure to produce immediate results. For the first time in decades, we can actually learn from this world instead of just taking from it." "Learn what exactly?" asked David Park, the former hydroponics supervisor whose greenhouse knowledge might be their salvation. "How to live without modern medicine, how to grow food in alien soil, how to communicate with beings who might not even want us here." "All of that," Grace answered before Robert could speak. She stood slowly, her teacher's instincts recognizing a moment that could define their future. "The evacuation committee saw us as used up, obsolete, past our useful years. But we've got something that Colony never appreciated. Experience. We've seen things work and fail. We know how to adapt." Helen pulled up her biological surveys on the tablet, data she had collected over years of careful observation. The Novani settlements cluster around specific geological formations. Their crops grow in soil that should be toxic to most life forms, but somehow they've made it fertile. Their structures seem to self-repair and adapt to weather changes. There's science here we never bothered to understand. Frank checked his old service weapon, more from habit than necessity. "Assuming they don't decide we're a threat now that we're vulnerable. Isolated groups can make desperate choices. Then we don't give them reason to see us as a threat," Robert decided. His engineer's mind was already working through possibilities, seeing solutions where others saw only problems. "We approach them not as colonizers but as refugees. We ask for help instead of taking what we want. We offer to share our knowledge in exchange for theirs." The conversation continued long into the night. But something had shifted in that common room. The despair that had greeted the ships. Departure was slowly being replaced by something else. Purpose. These elderly humans, written off as expendable by their own species, were about to discover that their greatest adventures might still lie ahead. Outside the settlement walls, beneath twin moons that cast silver light across the alien landscape, the Novani villages pulsed with their own gentle bioluminescence, and in those distant structures, ancient minds that had watched the human colony grow and change were beginning to take a new interest in the small group that had been left behind. 3 months after the last ship disappeared beyond the atmosphere, the morning alarm system finally gave up its electronic ghost. The piercing sound that had governed colony life for 15 years faded to silence, leaving only the gentle, rustling of wind through the native grass that was slowly reclaiming the outer settlements. Grace Kim woke naturally for the first time in decades. Her internal clock adjusted to the planet's 26-hour cycle rather than Earth's stubborn 24. Outside her window, the first fingers of dawn painted the sky in shades that had no names in any human language. Deep purples that shifted to gold, then to a blue so intense it seemed to hum with its own energy. The settlement had changed dramatically since those first desperate weeks. Where panic and despair had once ruled, a quiet determination had taken root. The elderly colonists had proven remarkably adaptable, their decades of experience allowing them to find solutions that younger minds might have missed entirely. In the former administrative center, Robert Hayes studied hand-drawn maps spread across tables that had once held digital displays. The colony's computer systems were failing one by one, but the old engineer had discovered something liberating in returning to paper and pencil. His sketches showed water flow patterns, soil composition data, and the locations of Novani settlements with far more detail than any satellite survey had ever provided. The third hydroponic bay is completely down, reported David Park as he entered the room, his clothes dirty from morning work in what they now called the transition gardens. But the experimental plots using native soil are showing better growth rates than anything we achieved with the old systems. Helen Rodriguez looked up from her microscope, where she had been examining soil samples that defied everything she thought she knew about planetary biology. The microbial communities in Novani agricultural areas are incredibly complex. There are symbiotic relationships here that make our best hydroponic solutions look primitive. Any word from our neighbors? Robert asked, referring to the Novani settlement that lay just beyond the colony's original perimeter. For weeks, Grace had been making careful approaches, leaving small gifts and attempting basic communication. Grace shook her head, but her expression remained hopeful. I've been leaving samples of our crops at the boundary stones. They're always gone by morning, and sometimes I find native fruits in return. It's not conversation yet, but it's definitely communication. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their planning session. Frank Wilson entered, moving more easily than he had in months. The combination of physical labor and Helen's experimental herbal treatments had done wonders for his old war injuries. We've got visitors, he announced, his tone careful but not alarmed. Through the main window, they could see a group of Novani approaching across the meadow that separated their settlements. 3 tall figures moved with the fluid grace that characterized their species, their pale blue skin seeming to shimmer in the morning light. They wore simple garments that appeared to be grown rather than woven, and they carried no visible technology. This is it, Grace whispered, her heart racing with the excitement of a teacher about to begin the most important lesson of her career. Everyone stay calm. Remember, they've been watching us for months. They know we're not the same humans they dealt with during the colony expansion. The lead figure stopped at what had once been the colony's security perimeter, now marked only by a low stone wall that David had built using native materials. When Grace approached, the Novani spoke in a voice like wind through crystal chimes. Keeper of Memories comes, the translation device that Grace had cobbled together. From spare parts managed to convey, the old ones left behind are seen. The deep time speaks of change. Grace's hands trembled as she worked to respond through the device. Her years of linguistic study had given her some grasp of Novani communication, but she knew she was missing layers of meaning that went beyond words. We ask for teaching. Our ship clan has gone beyond sky. We remain with soil and water. The Novani elder, who stood nearly 8 feet tall with features that seemed carved from moonlight, regarded her with eyes that held depths of intelligence that made Grace feel very young despite her 70 years. When he spoke again, his words carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones. The metal builders have been observed. The device translated haltingly. The young swift departed, the slow wise remain. This pattern is known to the deep memory. What followed was the most extraordinary communication session of Grace's life, using a combination of the translation device, hand gestures, and simple drawings in the dirt. The Novani elder began to convey concepts that challenged everything. The colonists thought they knew about their new world. Helen's scientific background allowed her to grasp some of the implications immediately. The Novani weren't simply primitive agriculturalists. They were sophisticated biological engineers who had spent millennia perfecting sustainable technologies that worked with natural systems rather than against them. Their soil isn't just dirt, Helen explained excitedly to the others during a break in the communication session. It's a living system. They've cultivated microbial communities that can break down toxins, concentrate nutrients, and even repair themselves when damaged. Robert's engineering mind was equally amazed by what he was learning. The Novani structures that had seemed so simple were actually marvels of biological architecture. They could regulate temperature, filter air, and even expand or contract based on the needs of their inhabitants. They're offering to teach us, Grace reported after hours of careful conversation. But there's something else. They keep referring to the deep memory and the pattern of choosing. I think they've seen this before. Other species, other colonies. Frank, who had remained quietly observant throughout the exchange, asked the question that was forming in all their minds. What happened to those other species? The Novani elders' response, when it came, was complex and layered with meaning that the translation device could barely convey. But the essence was clear. Some had learned and grown, while others had failed to adapt and had vanished into the deep time as the sun reached its zenith. The elder made an offer that would change everything. In exchange for the humans' willingness to learn, the Novani would share the knowledge that had sustained them for millennia. But the learning would require patience, humility, and a willingness to see the world through entirely different eyes. "We accept," Robert said without hesitation, speaking for the group that had somehow become a family in their isolation. "We have time, and we have the will to learn." The elder's response carried what Grace could only interpret as approval. Over the following weeks, small groups of Novani began visiting the human settlement regularly. They brought seeds that could grow in previously barren soil, techniques for purifying water using living filters, and methods for creating light and heat using bioluminescent organisms. David Park became fascinated with Novani agriculture, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated soil health and crop readiness. His engineering background helped him understand the mechanical principles behind their biological solutions, and soon he was successfully growing hybrid crops that combined human vegetables with native growing methods. Helen threw herself into studying Novani medicine, discovering that many of their healing techniques used controlled symbiotic organisms that could repair tissue damage and fight disease more effectively than traditional pharmaceuticals. Her experimental treatments began curing ailments that the colony's medical bay had only been able to manage. Frank found that Novani defensive strategies relied on environmental awareness and community cooperation rather than weapons and barriers. Their settlements were protected by early warning systems based on animal behavior and plant responses, and by structures that could literally disappear into the landscape when threatened as winter approached. The elderly human community looked nothing like the desperate group that had been abandoned months earlier. They had learned to work with the planet's natural rhythms rather than fighting them. Their food was healthier, their bodies stronger, and their minds more engaged than they had been in years. But most importantly, they had discovered something that the evacuation had inadvertently given them: the freedom to become something new, no longer bound by the expectations and limitations of colonial society. They were free to learn, grow, and adapt in ways that their former lives had never allowed. The Novani elder, who Grace had learned to call by the rough approximation Keeper, watched their progress with what she increasingly recognized as satisfaction. The deep memory had recorded this pattern before, and the signs were promising. The old ones left behind were proving that wisdom could triumph over despair, and that true strength came from knowing when to change. Fail the choosing. They see only what they wish to take, not what they might learn. They abandon their wise ones for the strength of youth, then wonder why their strength brings no lasting peace. Grace felt the weight of understanding settling over her like a physical presence. "You've been testing humanity all along, not just us, but our entire species. The way we colonized, the way we expanded, the way we treated both you and our own people. The choosing is not a test of strength," the keeper explained. "It is a revelation of character. Young species reveal their true nature when they believe themselves powerful and when they believe themselves weak. Most show their worst selves in both conditions." Frank understood immediately. His military experience had taught him that crisis revealed people's true nature more clearly than years of peacetime observation. The evacuation was the final test. Our own people abandoned us, but we chose to work with you instead of trying to dominate or despair. We chose cooperation over conquest. The ancient Novani who had spoken earlier continued her explanation, and Grace's translation device struggled to convey concepts that had no human equivalent. The Novani were part of something called the Deep Network, a coalition of species that had transcended the cycle of expansion and destruction that trapped most galactic civilizations. "We are the Watchers," Grace translated, her voice filled with awe. "We observe young races as they grow, guide them when possible, protect them from threats they cannot yet understand. But we can only help those who choose wisdom over power, cooperation over dominance. Helen's xenobiological training helped her grasp the implications. The technologies you've shared with us, they're not just survival techniques, they're a foundation. You're preparing us for something bigger. The Keeper's response confirmed her suspicions. The elderly humans had demonstrated qualities that the Deep Network valued: adaptability without aggression, strength without cruelty, and most importantly, the wisdom to value their experienced members rather than discarding them as obsolete. Your ship clan failed the Deep choosing, the Keeper explained. They valued speed over wisdom, youth over experience, profit over sustainability. But the old ones left behind have shown a different path. You have proven that your species carries the seed of wisdom even if it has not yet learned to nurture it. Robert leaned forward, his practical mind already working through the possibilities. What happens now? Do you reveal yourselves to the rest of humanity? Do you help us rebuild our colonies? The ancient female Novani's response was complex and layered with implications that would take time to fully understand. The Deep Network did not impose solutions on younger species. They provided opportunities, guidance, and support, but the fundamental changes had to come from within. The deep memory shows us that lasting change cannot be forced, Grace translated. It must grow from understanding, from choice, from the wisdom that comes only through experience. You 847 have learned. Now you must choose whether to teach. The weight of that responsibility settled over the elderly humans like a mantle. They had survived abandonment, learned to thrive in an alien environment, and proven themselves worthy of ancient wisdom. But now they faced a choice that would determine not just their own fate, but potentially the future of human civilization. David Park, who had been quietly absorbing the magnitude of what they were learning, asked the question that hung unspoken in the air. What if the rest of humanity isn't ready? What if they reject what we've learned? What if they see us as the same expendable old people they abandoned? The Keeper's response carried what Grace could only interpret as gentle amusement. The deep memory shows that wisdom often appears first in those whom youth considers obsolete. The old ones left behind have advantages that the ship clan lacks. You have time to think deeply, experience to guide judgment, and freedom from the ambitions that cloud younger minds. As the conversation continued into the evening, illuminated by the soft bioluminescence of Novani technology that was actually ancient science, the elderly humans began to understand the true scope of their situation. They were not castaways on a forgotten world. They were students in a university that had been operating for millions of years, and their final examination had just begun. The Novani offered them a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could remain on this world, living peacefully with the knowledge they had gained, or they could return to human space as teachers carrying technologies and philosophies that could transform their species. But the choice came with a warning. The path of teaching was dangerous, filled with rejection, suspicion, and the possibility that their own people would see them as threats rather than saviors. Frank looked around at the faces of his fellow survivors, seeing not the abandoned elderly that the evacuation ships had left behind, but the wise teachers they had become. How long do we have to decide? Time moves differently in the deep memory, the Keeper replied. But your ship clan's colonies struggle without the knowledge you have gained. The choosing time grows short. 2 years after the evacuation ships had disappeared beyond the stars, Robert Hayes stood in what had once been the colony's main conference room and marveled at how completely everything had changed. Where digital displays had once shown production quotas and resource allocation charts, living walls now pulsed gently with bioluminescent patterns that monitored air quality, temperature, and the health of the settlement's inhabitants. The room itself had grown rather than been built, its curved walls formed from a symbiotic organism that the Novani had helped them cultivate. It breathed with the rhythm of the planet, filtering toxins from the air and generating a subtle warmth that made even the oldest colonists feel energized. Rather than tired Grace, Kim entered through an opening that dilated to accommodate her, the biodoor recognizing her genetic signature and opening with a whisper of displaced air. Her appearance had changed dramatically over the past months. Her hair, once gray and thinning, now grew thick and lustrous thanks to Novani medical treatments. Her skin had lost its age spots and wrinkles, not through artificial means but through the natural healing that came from living in harmony with a world that had been designed to nurture life. "The Keeper wants to speak with all of us," she announced, her voice carrying an undertone of excitement and nervousness. "He says the Deep Network has made a decision about humanity." Helen Rodriguez looked up from the biocomputer where she had been analyzing the genetic structure of hybrid crops that produced yields impossible under standard agricultural methods. Her research had revealed that Novani science operated on principles that made human biotechnology look like children playing with simple tools. Decision about what specifically? Our readiness for contact, our worthiness for membership? Both, Grace replied. And something about what he calls the greater pattern. He says the Deep Network has been watching not just us but the development of human civilization across multiple star systems. Apparently, our situation here is part of something much larger. Frank Wilson emerged from the security center, where monitoring systems that combined human engineering with Novani biological sensors kept watch over their expanded territory. At 77, he moved with the fluid grace of someone decades younger, his body rejuvenated by treatments that worked with natural cellular processes rather than fighting them. "I've been tracking communications from the outer colonies. What little we can intercept suggests things are getting worse out there. Food shortages, political instability, conflicts over resources." David Park arrived from the agricultural sectors, where bioformed structures housed crops that thrived in conditions that would have killed traditional earth plants. "The yield reports are extraordinary. We're producing enough food to support twice our population, and the soil is actually improving rather than depleting. If we could teach these methods to the struggling colonies." "That's exactly what the Keeper wants to discuss," Grace interrupted. "But he's bringing someone else, someone he calls an ancient voice, a being that has been part of the Deep Network since before humans discovered fire." The implications of that statement settled over them like the planet's evening mist. They had grown accustomed to the idea that the Novani were far older and more advanced than they appeared, but the concept of meeting a being that predated human civilization by millennia was both thrilling and terrifying. When the Keeper arrived, he was accompanied by a presence that defied easy description. The ancient voice did not have a fixed form, but seemed to exist as patterns of light and shadow that suggested rather than defined a shape. When it communicated, the words formed directly in their minds, bypassing language entirely. "Young builders of metal and fire," the ancient voice said, its mental touch gentle but overwhelming in its depth. "We have watched your species spread across the stars with the hunger that drives all young races. You consume worlds, exploit resources, expand without wisdom. This pattern we have seen 10,000 times across the deep time." Robert felt his engineering mind struggling to process communication that bypassed his normal cognitive processes. "But we've learned, at least, we've begun to learn, the techniques you've taught us, the philosophy of working with natural systems rather than against them." "Yes," the ancient voice replied, its mental presence carrying what felt like approval. "The old ones left behind have shown the capacity for growth that your species possesses. But knowledge without context is dangerous. Understanding without perspective leads to catastrophe. You must know the full truth before you choose your path." What followed was a revelation that dwarfed everything they had learned before. The Deep Network was not simply a collection of advanced species. It was a carefully maintained system of cosmic gardeners, species that had evolved beyond the destructive phase of civilization and dedicated themselves to nurturing younger races toward wisdom. "Your galaxy contains 17 million species that have achieved interstellar travel," the ancient voice explained. "Of these, fewer than 300 have successfully transcended the expansion-destruction cycle. Most destroy themselves through war, environmental collapse, or resource depletion. Others are destroyed by older species who see them as threats. Only a precious few learn to choose wisdom over power." Helen's scientific mind reeled at the implications. You're saying that the vast majority of spacefaring civilizations fail? That expansion itself is a trap? Not expansion, but the philosophy that drives it, the keeper clarified through Grace's translation. The belief that taking is strength, that youth is superior to age, that resources exist to be consumed, rather than stewarded. These beliefs create civilizations that burn bright and die young. Grace asked the question that was forming in all their minds. What makes the 300 different? What allowed them to survive and grow? The ancient voice's response came with images that formed directly in their consciousness. Species that had learned to value wisdom over strength, cooperation over competition, sustainability over growth, civilizations that had discovered that true power came not from taking but from nurturing, not from speed but from patience. Each successful species found its own path to wisdom, the ancient voice continued. But all share common elements. They learned to value their elders, to think in terms of generations rather than quarters, to see themselves as gardeners of life rather than consumers of resources. Frank understood immediately. The evacuation wasn't just abandoning us. It was demonstrating exactly the kind of thinking that destroys civilizations, discarding wisdom for youth, immediate survival over long-term planning, efficiency over compassion. Precisely, the ancient voice replied. Your ship clan made the choice that 97% of species make when faced with crisis. They chose speed over wisdom, strength over experience, but the old ones left behind demonstrated a different path. David looked around at his fellow survivors, seeing them with new eyes. We're not just individuals who learned to adapt. We're proof that humanity has the capacity for wisdom. We represent the potential for our entire species to evolve beyond the destructive phase. The weight of that responsibility was staggering. 847 elderly humans, abandoned on an alien world, had become the key to their species' survival, not through their strength or their technology, but through their wisdom and their willingness to learn from others. The deep network offers humanity a choice, the ancient voice continued. We can provide the knowledge and technology needed to heal your failing colonies, to restore your damaged worlds, to build a sustainable galactic civilization. But only if your species proves capable of fundamental change. Grace felt the magnitude of the decision they faced. And we're the proof of concept. If we can successfully teach what we've learned, if we can convince humanity to change its core values, then the deep network will help. But if we fail, if you fail, your species will follow the path of the 97%, the keeper explained gently. Not through malice or judgment, but through the natural consequences of choices made. Civilizations that cannot learn wisdom destroy themselves through their own actions. Robert's practical mind immediately began working through the logistics. How do we even begin? How do we convince colonies that are struggling to survive that they need to fundamentally change their approach to civilization? How do we prove that elderly wisdom is more valuable than youthful energy? The ancient voice's response carried what felt like ancient amusement. You begin the same way all great changes begin, with a single demonstration that success is possible. You return to human space not as refugees seeking rescue, but as teachers carrying solutions. You show rather than tell, prove rather than argue. Helen realized the scope of what they were being asked to do. We're not just sharing agricultural techniques or medical treatments. We're proposing a complete transformation of human civilization, a shift from exploitation to stewardship, from competition to cooperation, from youth worship to wisdom honoring. The deep memory shows that such changes always begin with small groups who embody the new way. The keeper explained. The old ones left behind have become something new. You are humans who have learned the wisdom path. Now you must decide whether to teach it to your ship clan. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of cosmic responsibility. They had thought they were simply learning to survive on an alien world. Instead, they had been preparing to potentially save their entire species from the fate that claimed most galactic civilizations. Frank broke the silence with a question that went to the heart of their situation. What happens if we succeed? If we convince Humanity to change if we prove worthy of membership in the deep network? The ancient voice's response came with images of possibilities that stretched across time. Human colonies working in harmony with their environments, technologies that enhanced life rather than exploiting it, star systems where multiple species collaborated rather than competed, but also warnings of the challenges that lay ahead. Success brings responsibility, the ancient voice explained. Member species of the deep network become gardeners. Themselves, you would help guide younger races, protect them from the mistakes you once made, nurture them toward wisdom. It is a path of service that spans millions of years. Grace felt both exhilaration and terror at the prospect. Millions of years? But we're human. We live for decades, not millennia. The wisdom path changes more than philosophy, the keeper replied through her translation. Species that join the deep network learn to extend their existence, to think in terms of deep time, rather than brief time. The treatments we have shared with you are the beginning of that transformation. Helen looked down at her hands, noting how the age spots had faded and the arthritis pain had disappeared. She had assumed the improvements were simply advanced medicine, but now she understood they were something far more profound. You're offering us longevity, the ability to see our work through across centuries? We offer the possibility, the ancient voice corrected, but only to those who prove they can use such gifts wisely. Extended life without wisdom becomes a curse. Power without purpose leads to stagnation. The deep network grants such abilities only to those who demonstrate they will use them in service of life itself. David felt the weight of the decision they faced. To return to human space meant leaving the peaceful life they had built, facing rejection and suspicion from their own species, and taking on responsibility for the future of human civilization. But to remain meant accepting that humanity might follow the path of the failed 97%. How much time do we have to decide? Robert asked, his engineer's mind already cataloging the preparations that would be needed for either choice. The keeper's response carried urgency that had been absent from previous communications. Your ship clan's colonies begin to fail. Food riots on 3 worlds, resource wars on 2 others, political collapse spreading through the outer systems. If change does not come soon, the cascade failure will reach a point where even deep network intervention cannot prevent catastrophe. The ancient voice added a layer of context that made their situation even more critical. The pattern shows that species have approximately 50 of their standard years from the onset of serious decline to either achieve wisdom or face extinction. Your ship clan is now in the 37th year of this cycle. Grace felt the clock ticking in her mind. 13 years to transform an entire civilization, to convince billions of humans to abandon the values and assumptions that had driven their expansion across the galaxy. It seemed impossible, yet the alternative was unthinkable. We'll need to split up, Frank realized, his military training helping him think strategically about the challenge. Small groups going to different colonies, demonstrating the solutions we've learned, building networks of people who understand the new way. Helen nodded, her scientific background helping her see the pattern. Like a beneficial infection, each successful demonstration creates a center that can spread the knowledge further, but we'll need to be careful. Revolutionary ideas often trigger violent reactions from established power structures. Robert's engineering mind was already working through the logistics. We'll need to package our knowledge in ways that show immediate practical benefits: food security, medical treatments, environmental restoration. People will accept philosophical changes more easily when they come with solutions to pressing problems. David added his agricultural perspective. And we'll need to prove that our methods work in different environments. What we've learned here might not directly translate to other worlds, but the principles should be adaptable. The ancient voice listened to their planning with what felt like approval. The old ones left behind think like gardeners. You understand that change must be nurtured rather than forced, that different environments require different approaches, that patience and persistence matter more than speed and power. Grace asked the practical question that would determine everything. Will you provide us with transport? With the tools and knowledge we'll need, with protection if our own people see us as threats? The deep network provides guidance and knowledge, the keeper replied. But the work itself must be done by those who seek change. We cannot impose wisdom. We can only support those who choose to pursue it. The ancient voice added important clarification. You will not be alone. Other species in the deep network have faced similar challenges with their own civilizations. Their experience and support will be available to you. But the fundamental choice to change must come from humanity itself. As the conversation continued deep into the night, the elderly humans began to understand that they were being offered more than just the chance to help their species. They were being invited to become part of something cosmic in scope, a network of gardeners working to nurture life and wisdom. Throughout the galaxy, the choice they faced was both simple and impossibly complex. Remain in the peaceful life they had built, and watch their species potentially destroy itself, or return to human space to attempt the most important teaching mission in human history. I know what my answer is, Frank said finally, his military sense of duty overriding any personal desire for peace. I've spent my whole life protecting people. I can't stop now just because the scale got bigger. Helen nodded her agreement. My career was supposed to be about understanding life. Now I have the chance to help preserve it on a galactic scale. How could I choose anything else? David looked around at the bioformed walls that had become home, at the gardens that had taught him new ways of nurturing growth. I've learned to help things grow in impossible conditions. Maybe that's exactly what humanity needs right now. Grace felt the weight of translation, of being the bridge between species and philosophies. I've always been a teacher. Now I have the most important lesson in human history to share. Robert, the practical engineer who had held them together through their darkest hours, made the decision that would define their future. Then we go back. We take what we've learned and we teach our people that there's a better way. Even if they reject us, even if they call us traitors or fools, we have to try. The ancient voice's response carried what felt like profound satisfaction. The old ones left behind have chosen the wisdom path. The deep network will provide what support we can. But remember, the greatest changes often begin with those whom the world considers least important. Your ship clan abandoned you as obsolete. That abandonment may prove to be humanity's salvation. 5 years after the evacuation ships had left them to die, the elderly colonists returned to human space aboard vessels that defied everything the colonial authorities thought they knew about technology. The ships seemed to be grown rather than built, their hulls pulsing with gentle bioluminescence, their interiors forming and reforming to accommodate their passengers' needs. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of Meridian Station, watching the impossible vessels approach. With a mixture of awe and terror, she had been a junior officer during the evacuation of Settlement 7, had watched 847 elderly colonists being written off as acceptable losses. Now those same people were returning with technology that made the colonial fleet look like children's toys. Identification confirmed. Her communications officer reported, his voice tight with disbelief. It's them. Robert Hayes, Helen Rodriguez, Grace Kim, Frank Wilson, all showing as alive and healthy. But the biometric readings don't make sense. They're showing cellular ages 20 to 30 years younger than their chronological ages. Sarah's hands trembled as she activated the communication array. 5 years ago, she had been ordered to classify the Settlement 7 abandonment as a necessary strategic withdrawal. The guilt had eaten at her ever since, knowing that they had left good people to die simply because bureaucrats had deemed them expendable. Incoming vessels. This is Admiral Chen, aboard Meridian Station. Please state your intentions and explain your current status. The response came in Robert Hayes's familiar voice, but there was something different about it, a calmness and depth that hadn't been there before. Admiral Chen, this is Robert Hayes representing the Settlement 7. Survivors, we're requesting permission to dock and share information critical to the survival of the colonial territories. Share information? Sarah's Chief of Staff, Commander Williams, whispered urgently. Admiral, those ships are using technology we've never seen. We should consider them a potential threat. But Sarah remembered Robert Hayes, the man who had built half the infrastructure on Settlement 7, who had solved engineering problems that had stumped teams of younger specialists. If he said he had critical information, she was going to listen. Permission granted. Robert, Doc, at Bay 7, and, "Robert, it's good to hear your voice." What followed was the most extraordinary briefing in colonial history. The elderly survivors didn't look like refugees or victims. They moved with confidence and vitality that seemed impossible for people their
age. Their clothes appeared to be living fabric that responded to environmental conditions. Their equipment seemed to anticipate their needs. "We know how this looks,"
Grace Kim began, addressing the packed briefing room full of colonial officials, scientists, and military officers. "You left us to die, and we came back with impossible technology. You're wondering if we're still human, if we can be trusted, if we've been compromised by alien influence." The murmur that ran through the room confirmed her assessment. Helen Rodriguez stepped forward, her appearance so dramatically improved that many attendees struggled to recognize the elderly xenobiologist, who had been evacuated 5 years earlier. "We are still human," Helen said, her voice carrying authority that commanded attention. "But we're humans who have learned a different way of living. We've discovered technologies that work with biological systems instead of against them, philosophies that value wisdom over youth, approaches that see cooperation as strength rather than weakness." David Park activated a portable growing system that expanded from a small container into a full agricultural demonstration. Within minutes, plants were sprouting from soil that had been barren moments before, growing at rates that defied everything the observers thought they knew about botany. "Food security is the foundation of civilization," David explained as the impossible garden flourished before their eyes. "Every colony is struggling with diminishing yields, soil depletion, crop failures. We can teach you methods that not only solve these problems but actually improve environmental conditions." Frank Wilson's presentation focused on defense and security, but from angles that surprised the military officers present. Instead of weapons and barriers, he demonstrated early warning systems based on biological sensors, protective structures that could camouflage themselves completely, and community organization principles that made societies more resilient to both external threats and internal conflicts. "Security isn't about being stronger than your enemies," Frank explained. "It's about building communities that don't create enemies in the first place, that can adapt to threats instead of just fighting them, that value the wisdom of experience alongside the energy of youth." But it was Grace Kim's revelation that truly shattered their assumptions about their situation. "We're not alone in the galaxy," she announced, her words falling into stunned silence. "There are thousands of species out there, most of whom have gone through the same expansion phase that humanity is experiencing now. Most of them didn't survive it." The implications of that statement rippled through the room like a shockwave. Robert took over, his engineer's mind, helping him present the cosmic perspective they had gained. 97% of spacefaring civilizations destroy themselves within 50 years of achieving interstellar expansion, he explained, displaying data that the deep network had allowed them to share. They expand too fast, consume too much, discard wisdom in favor of youth and speed. They burn bright and die quickly. Admiral Chen found her voice first. "Are you saying humanity is doomed? That our expansion was a mistake?" "We're saying that humanity has a choice," Helen replied. "We can continue on the path that destroys civilizations, or we can learn a different way, the same way that 300 species have successfully learned before us." What followed were demonstrations that left the colonial leadership speechless, medical treatments that reversed aging and cured diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries, agricultural techniques that could restore dead worlds to fertility, energy systems that worked in harmony with planetary ecosystems, communication technologies that enabled true understanding between different species, but more impressive than the technology was the philosophy behind it. The elderly survivors had returned not as conquerors or saviors, but as teachers. They offered their knowledge freely, asked for nothing in return, and demonstrated through their own transformed lives that radical change was possible. "Why should we trust you?" Commander Williams demanded, voicing the suspicion. that many in the room felt. You've been influenced by aliens. How do we know this isn't some kind of invasion by proxy? Frank's response was simple and devastating in its honesty. Because if we wanted to conquer you, we wouldn't need to ask permission. The technology we've learned could disable every ship in the colonial fleet without harming a single person. We're here because we care about humanity's future, not because we need anything from you. Grace added the perspective that would prove most persuasive. Look around this room. How many of you are over 60? How many colonies have mandatory retirement ages? How many of your best engineers, doctors, and teachers have been forced into obsolescence because bureaucrats decided that youth was more valuable than experience? The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed what they already knew. Human civilization had been systematically discarding its greatest resource, the accumulated wisdom of its eldest members. We're offering you a chance to learn from our mistakes, Robert concluded. To build a civilization that values all its members, that thinks in terms of generations rather than quarters, that sees itself as part of a larger galactic community rather than as conquerors of an empty universe. The debates that followed lasted for weeks. Some colonies embraced the new technologies and philosophies immediately, desperate for solutions to their mounting crises. Others rejected them as alien contamination, preferring familiar failures to foreign successes, but slowly, inevitably, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Colonies that adopted the settlement. 7 innovations began to thrive. Their food production increased, their environmental problems decreased, their populations became healthier and more stable. Most importantly, they began to value their elderly citizens as sources of wisdom rather than drains on resources. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Change on the scale of entire civilizations took time, and there was resistance from entrenched interests who profited from the old ways. But the seed had been planted, and it was growing 10 years after their return. The elderly survivors of Settlement 7 watched as the first human delegation prepared to meet with representatives of the Deep Network. The meeting was taking place on a neutral world, with humanity finally ready to take its place among the galaxy's mature civilizations. Grace Kim, now serving as humanity's first interspecies ambassador, stood with her fellow survivors on the observation deck of a bioship that hummed with the harmony of living technology. Around them, representatives from dozens of species worked together on projects that spanned star systems and geological ages. Did we do it? David asked, watching as human children played alongside young beings from a dozen different worlds. Did we actually save our species? Helen smiled, her attention focused on a collaborative medical project where human doctors worked with alien healers to develop treatments for diseases that affected multiple species. We planted the seeds. Whether humanity continues to grow in wisdom will depend on choices that millions of people make every day for generations to come. Frank nodded toward a joint military exercise where human and alien forces practiced defensive techniques that protected entire star systems without firing a single shot. The old way was about conquest and control. The new way is about cooperation and stewardship. We've shown that the change is possible. Robert looked out at the vast expanse of stars, each one potentially hosting worlds where young civilizations were facing the same choices that humanity had faced. Our real legacy isn't the technology we brought back. It's the proof that species can change, that wisdom can triumph over youth obsession, that cooperation is stronger than competition. Grace felt the weight of translation once again, but this time it was different. She wasn't just bridging the gap between humanity and one alien species. She was helping to build connections that spanned the galaxy. The Deep Network is expanding. Every species that joins makes it easier for the next one to find the wisdom path. As they watched, a new ship approached the gathering. Its design was unfamiliar, suggesting yet another species taking its first steps toward joining the galactic community. Somewhere aboard that ship were beings facing the same choices that humanity had faced. The same decisions between wisdom and power, cooperation and conquest. The elderly humans of Settlement 7 had discovered their true legacy, not in the children they had raised or the works they had built, but in the transformation they had helped bring about. They had been abandoned as obsolete, but they had become the bridge that carried their species into a larger, wiser, more connected universe. And in the bioformed gardens that grew throughout the human sectors of the deep network stations, plants that had been engineered on a distant world called Settlement 7 continued to flourish, their roots reaching deep into alien soil while their branches stretched toward the stars, a living symbol of what could grow when wisdom was valued over youth, when cooperation replaced conquest, and when the abandoned became the foundation of something greater than anyone had dared to imagine.